Relieved that it's just 3 verses from Matthew's Gospel. Thank you for sojourning with me into Genesis these past few weeks. The story of Hagar is really intertwined in the long saga of Abraham and Sarah, and her story might be unfamiliar to some of you. These readings are not in the lectionary cycle, and in some ways her story is a footnote in the Abrahamic lineage. But a few years ago, I got really interested in her story, and so that's why I'm preaching on her today. I am indebted to the scholarship of womanist biblical interpreters and theologians, and a womanist, to put it succinctly and incompletely, might be considered a black feminist, although she is much more than that. It is Alice Walker who coined the term womanist. Some of the questions a womanist scholar might ask of a text are: where are the women and girls? What are they doing? What are their names? When women speak and act, whose interests are they serving? What are the power dynamics in this story? How have black women historically related to this text? Who is God in this text? Is God invested in the flourishing of black women, their families, and the world? If you are a little geeky about the Bible like I am, and you're not put off by a few Hebrew words, I highly recommend the book Womanist Midrash, A Reintroduction to the Woman of the Torah and the Throne by Dr. Wilda Gaffney, an Episcopal priest and professor of Hebrew scripture at Bright Divinity School in Texas. So, some interesting things about Hagar. First, her name. She is from Egypt, and yet her name, Hagar, which in Hebrew would be pronounced Hagar, means the foreigner or the foreign thing. It is very unlikely that her birth parents gave her that name, and maybe Abraham and Sarah did. Hagar, as I'm going to refer to her for the sermon, also appears in Islamic literature, although she is not in the Quran. It is thought that her son Ishmael is the patriarch of Islam, just as Abraham and his son Isaac are considered the patriarchs of Judaism. Enslaved women in the antebellum South and their descendants deeply identify with this story of Hagar, who was enslaved, abused by her mistress, and yet found freedom. And there are echoes of Margaret Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale, in this story. I want to thank Leslie and Diego and all those who've had these very, very long readings the past few weeks. That will come to an end for now. The Bible's a big book, though. I mean, there are a lot of pages in here, so. What do we do with our sad stories? We all have them, of course, and sometimes we sweep them under the rug, and sometimes we perseverate on them and never let them go. Sometimes we twist ourselves into human pretzels, trying to turn them into something that is not a sad story. Sometimes we look for meaning in them or a lesson. And what if the sad story is from the Bible, our holy scripture? What do we do then? We might say that that's the way that God lets the world be and there's nothing we can do about it. We might exegete our way out of it, look at the vocabulary and the historical and social context and the scholars who say the story doesn't really matter because it didn't happen. Or we might skip over them altogether and just listen to the life-giving words of the prophets and Jesus himself. The story of Hagar is a sad one. It's not the saddest in the Bible. There are stories of women who are treated even more violently and cruelly, of stories of evil befalling children. Hagar's story is a sad one, but I have found myself drawn to it in the last couple of years, and I tried to not make it sad. I studied it, I did the word studies, I read the scholars, but I haven't found much of a lesson or even much hope, although there is a smidgen of it. All of which leads me to say, I am looking forward to sharing this sermon with you and inviting you to come alongside with me as we look at this sad story. One of the things that's hard about this story is that in its historical context, most of what happened was considered okay. Women who were not able to conceive were allowed to find a woman who could conceive and give that woman to her husband as a sort of second wife, and a male offspring, a son, would be considered a legitimate heir. This was very important back then. But, as Dr. Will DeGaffney noted, giving a sexually exploited woman another woman to exploit sexually is biblical justice. I am not reading this, she says, as a historical or ethical claim, but am acknowledging its Iron Age morality. Friends, not every morality lasts for all of time. Perhaps even more troubling is watching what God does in this story. God allows Hagar to be taken by Sarah. God allows Sarah to abuse Hagar without any sort of consequence. God tells Hagar after she runs away that she must return to the household of Sarah and Abraham so that her child will be born in safety, not in the wilderness where mother and child would be vulnerable. God promises that her son will become the father of many, and God keeps that promise. But is that enough? Does that slightly happy ending make up for all the sorrow? I don't know. I often don't know what to do with the sad stories in our lives and in the world. And I don't want to talk about too many of them because I really don't want to bum you out on a Sunday morning. But I'm afraid that if we don't talk about the sad stories, we might move into thinking that they don't matter, or they don't tell us something about ourselves or our culture. My heart broke into pieces this week when I heard the story of 1-year-old Kona Wiley who was shot and killed as police topped the car that he was in. What does it say about us that a 1-year-old baby is shot and killed? We have veered off the godly path. In our own lives, we have sad stories we don't like to share. Stories of betrayal, of loss, of unrealized hopes, stories that we're embarrassed by, of financial struggles or mental health issues. Any good therapist will tell you you can't bury those stories or they will fester into something worse. And it is very painful to look at them and to try to make sense of them and to try to find the benevolent hand of God in them. There is a hand of God in these sad stories from the Bible, but often it's too hard or too false to find any benevolence in them. But there might be a ray of sunshine in admitting that at least God is there. And because I don't want to bum you out this morning, I will look for some rays of sunshine in this story and in its aftermath. As mentioned, Hagar is an extraordinary woman in our scripture. She is the only person in the Bible to give God a name, El Roi, the God who sees. She is the first person in the Bible to be visited by an angel. She is the first woman in the Bible to liberate herself from oppression. She is the direct recipient of God's promise. God doesn't make a indirect promise to her through her husband. God promises her a blessing to her face. And Hagar lives. She escapes slavery. She leaves the place of abuse. She finds water in the desert. Her son lives. They travel back safely to her Egyptian home, and she dies in her homeland, and her son does become the father of many. I wonder if those who identify with Hagar find some sort of solace in knowing that her sad story is in the Holy Scripture. I wonder if that makes them feel seen by God as someone who experienced abuse, as someone whose body was used for others' purposes, as someone who was enslaved. I hope that this sad story might serve in that way. But there's more for us in here, because sometimes we might feel like Hagar. But sometimes we might be more like Abraham. We might let bad things happen to others because it suits our own needs and desires. And sometimes we might be Sarah and turn on our own. Sometimes we might be Ishmael or Isaac, beloved sons who must confront their family's dysfunction and trauma. So what do we take away from this particular sad story? There are pieces that might call to us today. Perhaps we hold the hope that God will inspire us to do better than those who came before us. That when we find ourselves in positions of power, we will do the right thing and honor the humanity of all those we meet. That we will not abuse another. That we will not allow our needs and desires to result in harm for anyone else. I don't know if you all are acquainted with the works of Gwendolyn Brooks. She was a poet. She died in 2000. At one point, she was the Poet Laureate of Illinois. In 1950, she won a Pulitzer Prize for her poetry, and she was the first African American to win the Pulitzer Prize. She wrote a poem called To Black Women, and for me, it really resonates with this story of Hagar, and may be an encouragement to all those who find their story in hers. Sisters, where there is cold silence, no hallelujahs, no hurrahs at all, no handshakes, no neon red or blue, no smiling faces, prevail. Prevail across the editors of the world who are obsessed, self-honeying and self-crowned in this seduced arena. It has been a hard trudge. With fainting, bandaging, and death, there have been startling confrontations. There have been tramplings of monarchs and of other men. But there remain large countries in your eyes, shrewd sun, the civil balance, the listening secrets, and you create and train your flowers still to the glory of God. I invite you now to rise in body or spirit and sing number